recording. So again, try to do a rewrite before you upload your paper. Yeah, that way you know you're giving me the best work that you have in you at that point in time. I'm happy to look at, a rough draft or something. And what I'll usually do is just do a quick flyover and say, okay, when you're fixing this, these are the things to keep in mind. This looks pretty good. This could be clearer, could be stronger, whatever. Okay. But overall, really the papers were pretty good. The average on the papers is well above a B. When in a bell-shaped curve, it would be a C, and it's not. So if you're concerned about those kinds of things, as a cohort, it seems to me we're doing fine. Okay, and we're well into it now. All right. So what we're going to do here is everybody ready to do futuristic cinema and beatnik stereotypes in the discussion of the beats today? Is that
yes.
Okay? Does that sound good? That's all
Yeah.
we'll do. Okay.
So that excuse me, my
no
internet.
excuse for you, Quinn.
Okay. My internet cut out right when you were explaining about the future. Did you say that's the only presentation we're gonna do?
We're gonna do the first two.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah, we're gonna do the technology and turbulence article and the beatnik stereotypes and consumer culture one with some discussion of the beats and all that.
Okay.
Right? Now,
yeah, because I was doing the technology one.
Okay. Before we do that, I do this there's a little audio file for each module, but I wanted to just give you a sense of what's going on in the United States and indeed in the world at this period of time, to kind of set the stage for you. One of the main reasons I want to do that is there are striking parallels, if you wish to draw them, between what we're witnessing right now and what we saw in particularly the 1950s and the 1960s, okay? Among other things, we had one political party, and oddly enough, in both cases, it was the Republicans, but for different reasons, embracing a really fairly extremist view of things. Coming out of the Second World War, we had this global hegemony. We were the absolute singular dominant force on the planet. The British Empire was in shambles. They were barely clinging to the last remnants of their colonial empire because that was their only real source of income. The country was impoverished. London parts of it had been leveled. I mean, you see pictures of cities like Berlin, cities like London, Paris, and you'll see just rubble, you'll see just ruins, okay, and things like that. You look at the United States, everything looks brand new because a lot of it was, we were continuing to invest in infrastructure because remember, we were also trying to build and spend our way out of the Depression, both with the war, but also with public works. So we had all these new libraries, we had new public buildings, we had a number of very, very wealthy endowments that were pouring a lot of money into education and things like that. We had brand new university campus. The University of California campus, for example, exploded. It became like the showplace of American public universities. Intellectually, pedagogically, on a par with the Ivies, but affordable for middle-class America. We had the first GI Bill of Rights, in which a lot of people, like my father, were able to go to college who never would have been able to afford it. So we had an explosion in the American middle class. It was driven by public investment in that middle class in the form of accelerated education, infrastructure, inexpensive housing that one way or another was subsidized or backstopped by the government. We had a lot of government intervention in the economy, but we did not have socialism, okay? In other words, the government didn't own the means of production. The government did not really determine, build these houses with these plans in these places. But the government was kind of organizing and trying to plan a lot of these things along with private sector and private investment. So we had these explosive growth rates, right? Because remember, we're coming out of the Depression. We did have at least one significant recession in the mid to late 1950s. But overall, you saw very low unemployment, very high growth rate, and a significant expansion of the middle class, which doesn't sound much like today. What's similar is that in American political culture, there was a kind of cult of extreme views, in this case, in the, say, 50s and 60s, driven by anti-communism, okay? In other words, the fear was a tyranny from the left, a tyranny imposed by Moscow. Okay, China was not really on people's radar. We believed mistakenly in the concept of what was called monolithic communism. That is, there was one communism. It was dominated by Moscow. China was just, a lesser stepchild of, Soviet socialism and all that. We were wrong in that. But we didn't really figure that out till the 1970s. We being the foreign policy establishment of the United States. Okay. So on the one hand, you had the United States in this unprecedented position of global power and dominance. We've never been that dominant since then. No country had been that dominant prior to that over that much of the world. We were the first and only country, we remain the only country in the world to have completely encircled the globe with military installations, to be able to project force very quickly and very effectively anywhere else in the world. Okay. We were beginning to acquire that capacity by the 1950s. We had a very brief period of nuclear monopoly where we were the only country in the world with nuclear weapons. Okay. On the other hand, despite the fact that most of you probably got the impression that the 50s were this kind of boring, gray flannel, nothing much going on period of time, we had this virulent anti-communism. We had people whose lives and careers were destroyed simply because they wouldn't publicly condemn communism. We had people in the Dennis versus United States case in 1951 who merely for being members of the Communist Party were charged as advocating the violent overthrow of the state and went to federal prison for 5 years. Okay, now that's important because we have not really done that with other organizations the way we did. We were one of a handful of countries that has ever functionally outlawed communism. The other one at that point was Nazi Germany. Most of the rest of the world, for example, Italy had communist governments. They had a strong, viable communist party. One of the first things that the newly created CIA did after the passage of the National Security Act of 1947 was to intervene in the Italian elections to stop the communists from winning, to meddle in their elections. Okay, that was one of the most prominent and consistent interventions of the CIA, and one of its purposes, besides just gathering intelligence, was to mobilize support against the left everywhere in the world, because the fear was that people were going to follow the example of the Soviet Union. They were going to kind of try to withdraw from global capitalism, work within what was called the Comintern, right, which was a closed political economy of the communist states, right, dominated by the Soviet Union. And that therefore, we would lose opportunities for land, labor, and capital around the world. Okay, that's what a lot of the Cold War was about. It really was. Like any other war, it was about territory and treasure. Okay, so it was a strange period of time because on the one hand, it does seem like it was conformist. There was a lot of there was a lot of risk in being a political outsider or a social or sexual deviant or anything like that. You could go to prison, for not being heterosexual and engaging in sex. It was still a felony in most states of the Union. And yet we never had a federal anti-lynching law. And most states didn't have them. We were still in a situation with segregation where we had the Emmett Till case in 53, 54, for example, where we had a 14-year-old kid who was murdered. People were arrested, but they were tried by an all-white male jury in the South, and they were acquitted, and then years later admitted, yeah, we did it. Okay. It was a different country, but what we had were some of the forces like what we see today. We had conspiracy theories were running rampant. Okay. There was an organization called the John Birch Society, about which you might want to do a little reading. There's a decent Wikipedia entry, for example, for the John Birch Society. Okay. And this was a far-right, conspiracy-soaked movement driven by prominent business people. Okay. They were saying, for example, that communists had put fluoride in the water to control our minds, or that I'm trying to think of some of the other really outlandish ones. Well, Dwight Eisenhower was a communist, things like that. We also had United States senators, only one of whom was Joe McCarthy, who were blatantly lying, okay, about there are this many communists in the State Department. There are this many communists or communist sympathizers in the government. There are this many communists. What finally brought McCarthy down was 1954, the Army McCarthy hearings, where he had accused prominent members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the United States military of being communists and communist sympathizers. So he clearly had overreached. So what I'm saying is we had a kind of lunatic fringe, despite the fact that, yes, was there communist subversion in the United States? Absolutely, of course there was. Of course there was. There was American subversion all over the world. This is what powers do, okay? But the conspiracy theories had people in a state of kind of paranoia, where it was like, we would believe the most outlandish things. One of the worst things, and I mean, I'm old enough to have remembered as a really small kid. I asked my dad about this and he actually remembered it, where in our house, somebody was there and all of a sudden, when you're a kid, you pick up on things kind of belatedly. And all of a sudden the guy just went kind of pale and he and his wife got up and left really quickly. Well, the guy was a 5th grade school teacher. Somebody had accused him of being a communist and nobody in that room would back him. And they all knew him, right? He lost his job, he lost his career, and he only lived to be about 39. Drank himself to death. Okay, that was not uncommon, but because it was not driven by any desire to figure out what was going on in the country, it was driven by ignorance and hysteria and paranoia that were cultivated aggressively mostly by American business people, because the fear was that American labor, with all this new wealth that was being generated by corporations and this expansion of corporate profits, that American labor, having successfully organized during the Depression, was now going to flex its muscles and say, okay, you got to give us more. You got to give us safer working conditions. You got to give us shorter hours. You got to give us something more like the European labor system. You got to take care of us because we are the absolute backbone of the economy, primarily industrial labor and the Teamsters, transportation, right? And so almost immediately after the Second World War, business sided with disproportionately with the Republican Party to move against organized labor. By the 1970s, they had pretty much succeeded. Okay, but in that period between approximately 1950 and 1970, organized labor became very powerful, and with it, the middle class. Okay, all right. So again, you had, like you have today, you had political extremism, you have political violence. On the right and the left. The Klan was very powerful at this time, but increasingly so were student organizations. The Students for Democratic Society were formed in 1962. Okay, the free speech movement in Berkeley is 1963. Okay, and that kind of sets this tone for a critical mass of young people in the United States, kind of feeling it. For a new generation of people who were first generation university students. We had a massive influx of people into universities whose families had never spent a moment on a college campus. And all of a sudden, as I think some of you are probably experiencing, and as I know I did, you realize that knowledge is power. You start figuring out how things work in a way that you never would have done had you not had the opportunity to go to college. Okay, so this is actually, despite the sort of placid remembrances of it and everything, this was a really volatile, critical period in American history in terms of American industrial expansion, American military power, Eisenhower warning as he leaves office in 1961 about the dangers of the military industrial complex, right? All this stuff was deeply entrenched by the beginning of the 1960s, okay? So that's kind of what's going on here. In the midst of this, we have a lot of different kinds of resistance. We have resistance among musicians, much of it based on race, but not all of it. We have resistance in the arts because America has always been kind of an anti-intellectual culture. And yet, we're producing this new kind of theater and this new kind of art and this new kind of television and film that the world's never seen before. And we're declaring this to be the new art. So we're building culture as a brand new thing, in a sense. Okay. So all this stuff is going on. And it's in that context that I want us to think about, particularly these first two presentations. Any questions about that before we kick in and start going? All right. So who wants to start? We'll do futuristic cinema. Who wants to go first?
I could start.
Okay.
That's Quinn.
Yeah.
All right. So, I'll start now. I found this art while reading through the article. I found this very interesting. And I'm very glad it was assigned in this class. Anyways, so scientists back then, it was it was seen as a high paying job. You would work for a big company, maybe the government, making new munitions for the military or something, like bombs and all that stuff. After the Cold War and film, sci-fi film became a thing, much more prominent and popular, being a scientist instantly changed to the light of oh, they're scary, they're scary, they're not psychotic, they're crazy, scary scientists that want to blow up the world or take over the world or something. And that that was shown all through the film industry through what was it? It Came from outer space, Forbidden Planet, 20 Destination Moon, and what is it? 25,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Just all these films kind of just focused on scientists and brought them in the light of, oh no, they're going to take over the world. And I just thought that was very I didn't know how big, I knew the film industry would influenced a lot of people, but I didn't know it could change it to a subject that has been here since forever, what seems like forever, into
Let
this
me
bad thing.
hold on, Quinn. Let me stop you there. You raise a couple of assumptions we need to explore. All right. One of them was that that absolutely uniformly science and scientists were portrayed negatively. Is that really what the article says? Because I don't think it is. Now, all right, hold that point. Hold that point. We're going to come back to that. The second thing would be, insofar as there were popular representations of science and scientists in what are supposed to be movies for fun, why were those portrayals of science and scientists the way they were? Why were they that way? Had they been different before? Because I would refer you back to 1931 and the original, well, not so much the original, that was in 1919, but to Frankenstein. Karloff's Frankenstein was 1931. Clearly, Baron Frankenstein was a mad scientist. He was fooling around with the primal forces of nature. So in other words, it would seem to me that the dangerous scientist was hardly a new trope, first of all. Secondly, there were depictions of scientists in a lot of those 1950s movies who were not evil at all. Okay. So what I'm trying to get at is, let's stick to the. I mean, there were those tropes did come out of 50 science fiction and horror, of the malign or malevolent, mostly because they were looked at as amoral. They just had no morality. You know, they were just guided by the quest, right, to find out. No matter what the human implications are, we need to know this. That's true, but that's not necessarily so much uniformly evil as it is amoral. But put that in the context of what we were describing with the 1950s. Think about what was going on in the country at that time, because most of the movies you mentioned were made between 1950 and 1955.
I guess what was happening back then was the creation of the atomic bomb.
That was the 1940s.
Oh yeah, that was 1940s.
And for most of that time,
Rusty.
almost no one in America knew what was going on until we detonated those in August of 1945.
Yeah.
Okay. So between 45 and 50, yeah, we knew. Okay. We knew what they were, and we knew we're the only ones who had them. By
Yeah.
1950, roughly early 50s, the Russians, Soviet Union had them in part because they had stolen atomic secrets from us, in part because at the end of the Second World War, we got our Nazi scientists and they got the leftovers.
Yeah.
That is almost literally what happened. Okay. So let's look at this, and either of you can step in. Valeria, feel free to step in as well. First of all, let's be a little more systematic about what the nature was of the portrayal of science. Never mind scientists as characters. What about science?
I can talk a little bit.
Yeah.
So from what I gathered, it was there was a duality to the views about science and scientists. At the time, there were a lot of scientific breakthroughs that were good, like the polio vaccine in 1955, and then the double helix DNA discovery, that was the early 1950s. So those things kind of contributed to the positive perspective that people held about scientists.
What did they contribute to, though? In what way? What did they do that science wanted to do for which there was benefit?
There we go. They made improved quality of life, because lifespan was starting to go up after that. But then that, with effects of what science was doing, that was also having an effect on population growth, and people were concerned about overpopulation. So that was another thing that contributed to the other side of perspective, how people viewed scientists. And then also with the nuclear weaponry, and the implementation of that, a lot of people felt scared, had fear surrounding scientists. So there was that kind of.
Yeah. Okay. So let's take this in stages, because
Okay.
I think Valeria's got this. The first thing was that science was giving us ways of prolonging significantly the prospects of human life. That is, raising significantly the probability of human beings simply being able to live longer. Okay. I mean, your generation can't possibly understand how extraordinary it was to be able to vaccinate people against polio. Okay. In fact, I surprised my son. We were Skyping the other day, and I said, "Oh yeah, I remember you standing in line and getting a polio vaccination." He's like, "I didn't think you were that old." I'm like, "Yeah, but it was, I was scared because it was needles and stuff, but we knew that this was almost like a miracle because we knew kids who had polio. Okay. So there was that. There was the notion of what we were doing with the continuing improvement in antibiotics, right? Antibiotics really only become normalized and standardized really during the Second World War because of the imperatives of war. But, there were a lot of us, myself included, who without something as simple as penicillin would have died when I was 3. Okay. And we don't think about that anymore. We don't think about, children dying of fevers and things that could have been eliminated by infections that could have been fought off by antibiotics and things like that. So those at that time were looked at as these kinds of miracles. They were like these amazing things. So that's the first point that Valeria raises is, wow, science has this incredible power over life and so over death. But the other part of it was, the dark side of it perhaps, and the one thing that everyone feared was nuclear weapons. Okay, so if you look again at those science fiction movies of the 50s, how many of those focus on, the nuclear testing, nuclear weapons, this whole specter of, atomic apocalypse? That's important to the article and to this whole notion of 50s, speculative and futuristic cinema. So tell me a little bit about that.
I can go ahead again.
Sure.
So yeah, the films of the time reflected all the fears that people had surrounding the post-war, things about, it was just after Hiroshima and atomic weapons were still, I mean, it was the Cold War was becoming a thing. And so people were afraid, and that was reflected in films. And the messages in the films were generally like, back to the scientist thing. I think what Quinn was saying is that a lot of them were portrayed as misfits or outcasts of society to kind of like separate them from the public. And another thing in the films was that it wasn't just nuclear weaponry, it was just technology in general, and how technology and science was moving forward. And if that was, a lot of people were afraid of that. So things like that, themes like related to that were addressed in these films. And yeah, I'll stop there. Leave some room.
All right. I'm going to give you a proposition. Either one of you can respond to this. This goes back to when I was working on my PhD, and I did a seminar paper in an American cultural history class. And I wrote like a retrospective on science fiction as it reflected social and political values by decade, from 1950 through 1990. Okay, because that was roughly when I was finishing. Okay. One of the things I came up with was this template of two schools of scientists in the 1950s. And one of them was the independent, individual kind of what you were talking about, Valeria, the misfit scientist. And that misfit scientist almost always did bad. Even if they didn't mean to, they just did terrible things. And they turned people into lizards and lizards into people. And, they made fly heads on people and did all these terrible things, even though they may have been in some ways nice people, because they had questionable morality. Okay. Then there was what I refer to as the institutional scientist. These were the people who worked for the government, who worked for universities. They were generally benevolent, and they were generally sort of moderate to conservative in their views about science. They were respectful of the power of science, and they were cautionary. There's a movie called Them, all right? It was made in 54. And it's about these giant ants that show up in the Nevada desert, okay? It holds up pretty well it's a laugher, but there's nothing like 8-foot ants. Come on, man, it doesn't get any better than that. But anyway, there's a scientist there, and right at the end of the movie, spoiler alert, not because none of you are going to watch it, but he talks about what happened when we split the atom, and that we opened a door into this world that we don't understand and all that. So he was an institutionalist. He was from a university, and he was showing scientific conscience and responsibility. Okay. Does that play out in anything, the sort of individualist, sort of outsider, misfit, doing science in the garage person, and the institutionalist?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Because you will see in different movies different versions of that scientist and that kind of science. Oh, hi, Brett, you had your hand up. I didn't see that. Sorry.
Oh yeah, I just put it. Maybe it's just I've watched a lot of those movies, those old science fiction movies.
Yeah.
And I just guess
a little less of the old, okay? They're old.
The original science fiction movies. Yeah. There. And oh gosh, the first time I went to college, I attended this like whole week-long series of lectures about 1950s science fiction cinema and a lot of this stuff. And I just wish I had been a better student back then. But that's not really the point. That institutional scientist, one of the themes that it seems like that I recall is they have that fringy scientist person, and then your protagonist or whoever it may be, they always seem to seek out that institutional wisdom or the institutional science, like to counteract the fringe with the establishment. To be a pretty common theme. So not only does the institutional scientist have that respect for the power of the science, but in some aspect, even all of us regular people should also understand that there's, you know, two sides to every coin, just like there's anything. So, but to counteract it, you kind of need it. You can't have the bad without the good.
I think that's it. And so the challenge, what would you say, more specifically our presenters here, in terms of what you got out of the article, what were those movies, whether they intended to or not? Because remember, the primary purpose for putting these movies out is to make money largely off of young people who know nothing. Remember, only about 5% of America was going to college then. Okay.
Wow.
So most of us were just, you know, road workers of the future. And that was a noble thing, you know. But why would these movies be made that way? And what were they saying about science? You know, what is there a consistent theme that you garner from looking through this particular article? In other words, what's meant by technology and turbulence in the title? What does that mean? Go ahead, Quinn.
What I thought of that, like, is that technology opened the door to like a lot of things that like we take for granted today, like, and that stuff. And technology is always, I think, always personally gonna be turbulent because of how much stuff it brings to the table.
Well, let's not say stuff. Let's be more precise, because you're there. You're right there. What does it bring to the table? How does this turbulence look or feel to us? What is it? What is
bombs? Medication, vaccines, cures for like diseases that we never thought we would have. Smartphones.
Well, not in the 1950s.
Oh, not in
Remember,
the
we're in the
1950s. Television, the film industry, basically showing like media on a television being like, this is entertainment. It kind of just exploded entertainment industry.
Okay, but that's a thing, but that's not science. It's an application of science. But what we're trying to get at is, what are these in terms of the turbulence and technology? I think the article is intending that to be understood in a way other than, well, there were new media technologies coming out, stuff like that. That's not really the purpose of the thinking behind the article.
Well, I think it was, well, is that okay if I go ahead?
Yeah,
you can go.
Well, I think the technology, that all of this new technology was new and unknown. And I think that was part of it. That was the theme that was going on. We didn't know where it was going to lead. And a lot of these movies kind of played with that, and with fear and intriguing excitement, and use the utilization of all these different like gadgets and props and machinery, robots, whatever. They were intriguing for the audience, and that's how they made their money. And it also kind of spurred more of a fascination into that kind of stuff and more into technology going forward. I think that's what I got from the article.
That's much closer. In other words, again, it's like Brett was saying about the good and the bad. There can be real countervailing influences culturally from these things. On the one hand, these films were a response to a widespread ignorance about science and technology in the United States. I mean, we were still looked at as a kind of industrial peasantry by much of the rest of the world. We really were, and not always in a disparaging way, but peasants in the sense that we were tied to local, to localities, and you see in a lot of these old films, you see a lot of small town America and things like that. Partly because it's easier to shoot, it's cheaper to shoot. If you had to borrow a Studie's big city set or something, that was going to tap the budget. But also it was this idea of, like a giant spider invading a small town in the desert or something like that. But there was this notion of this kind of almost superstitious ignorance about these turbulence-inducing transformative technologies. Not just nuclear weapons and even nuclear power, but things like that you've suggested. I mean, something like a vaccine can frighten people. We've got the same thing going on today, right? And why? Because people don't understand the process. And to the extent that they understand the process, all of a sudden it mitigates the sense of risk. And, everything's got a risk. Again, getting back to Brett's point. I mean, yeah, vaccines, every once in a while, one of them's going to hurt somebody. But the idea is overwhelmingly on balance, they're going to benefit a society by allowing us to go out, to work together, to recreate together, to bring our kids out, put them in schools and live something like a, in brackets, normal life, right? So science is very twofold here. And this is what I think Valeria was getting at. On the one hand, yeah, a lot of hope for the future. Uncertainty can also yield potential and hope and optimism, but also this idea of this dread of uncertainty and the destructive power of a lot of this science. Renee?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, the duality that they talk about in the article reminded me of this point that I saw brought up on the internet like years ago, where it's funny how in Japan with movies like Godzilla, radioactive matter makes monsters, but in America it makes superheroes like Spider-Man.
Well, careful, because in the 1950s, it made monsters, just like
Right.
in Japan.
Right. I get that. I'm just saying, like, it just reminded me of like the two different perspectives of like the same kind of technology and point, depending on what happened in the two countries. Or
Let's use Godzilla as an example, Renee. When Godzilla was made, it was released in 1951. Okay. It wasn't just a response to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. What else was it a response to? This is really important, and a lot of Americans don't understand this. It was an experience, by the way, that a lot of Japan had who did not directly experience Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Fallout?
No, had nothing to do with nuclear power.
Just the influence of outside, just I'm struggling with the words. Japan had been an imperial power, and now they were experiencing the flip side of that, where they were the subjugated and kind of invaded people.
I'm going to give you something even more obvious.
Is it the medical intervention afterwards?
It's not even that, but but here's what it was. I know because I remember reading an interview with the director, and he was talking about what had shaped his thinking. It was a solid year of firebombing raids by the United States on Japanese cities. The burning down of vast swaths of not just rural, but urban Japan. Because remember that, you watch old Japanese movies, and I watch a lot of Japanese movies from the 40s and 50s. And right after the war, you can see, boy, they really got hit. And you'll still see, though, that the buildings in the inside, a lot of them are paper and wood. A lot of those cities, it's not that same sense of the big, massive, concrete kind of presence that you get with New York City or something like that. The cities look vulnerable and fragile. And the Japanese had endured a year of that. So much so that the architects of those firebombings, actually said to each other, if we lose this war, we will be hanged as war criminals for what we've done. They knew that what they were doing, well, they may have believed, look, this is going to shorten the war. It's going to defeat a belligerent imperial power. It's going to do all these things, but these things are targeting civilians. They weren't just targeting places where there were munitions and things like that. They were targeting, Tokyo and Osaka and places like that, particularly Tokyo. Tokyo was firebombed several times. Okay, well, what happens in Godzilla? Godzilla comes out, and what does he do? He burns down Tokyo. So, in other words, you can look at Godzilla as a Japanese cultural reaction to that dread and horror and trauma, not only, Renee, of 2 nuclear attacks, but also a year of firebombing. Okay, so the idea of apocalyptic destruction that cannot be controlled by powers that are so vast that they just dwarf any capacity to respond. and things like that. So no, I'm not at all saying that you're wrong and that it has nothing to do with nuclear attacks. But what a lot of Americans forget is we were firebombing them. We were dropping napalm on those cities. Okay. We were incendiary bombs, not even just regular, ordnance. We were dropping things intending to start vast urban fires and things like that, because that was total war. When people say total war, that's what they mean. In other words, your entire political economy is geared to war. That was the last time that America fought a total war. It was the last time that any major power fought a total war. Okay. The response to that in Japan was things like Godzilla. Okay. The response to that in the United States was the certainty of this extraordinary military power, counterbalanced by what both in some ways Quinn and Valeria were talking about, with this almost this dread of that very destructive capacity that had made us a global hegemon, that had not only made us secure, but had made us dominant. Okay. So this is really being played out in a very dramatic way, even with these little goofy, low budget movies. And remember too, that some of these movies were put out by major studios like Universal and Warner Brothers. I mean, these weren't all just quickie, cheapy movies. And they started really arguably with The Day the Earth Stood Still. That's 1950-51. And that movie ends with the world being warned in Washington, D.C. You better knock this shit off or we're going to destroy you completely. They're getting a severe talking to by an alien and his robot. That's liberal Hollywood, admittedly, saying, man, we got to be sensible about this. We got to stop this. Okay. So there's this, the turbulence is uncertainty. Both of you nailed that. The response to that turbulence is a combination of either cautionary tales or wild speculative paranoia. Okay. Very much like the era in which those movies were made. That's, I think, what the author's trying to get you to think about. Yeah. Renee, did you have your hand up?
Sorry, I didn't want to butt in again. And I forget exactly when it's made, but you said cautionary tales, and I thought about the Twilight Zone, because isn't that just like a bunch of seasons of cautionary tales about not exactly technology itself, but
some of it is, though.
Like there's the one about space travel, or there's the one about trusting the aliens that come down and accepting their new technology.
To serve man.
Yeah.
1958. That starts in 1958.
That's just
yeah, Rod Serling's first season is 1958. And those were almost all of them cautionary tales. And they were cautionary tales about science. They were cautionary tales about totalitarianism, about freeing people's minds from, Soviet-style totalitarianism. But also some of those people, Serling included, were concerned about the capacity of the American state or the American corporate state pulling together to make us into drones and things like that, to just make us into these workers. There was a real, you see what we're getting simultaneously. And Rod Serling's a classic example of that. Serling serves as a paratrooper in the South Pacific in the Second World War. He's invalided out of the Army. He gets out as a veteran. He gets pretty much a full ride scholarship, and he goes to this very hip, progressive, small university called Antioch. And a lot of the people there are World War II veterans. And some of them are conservative, some of them are liberal, whatever. But all of them, almost all, are first generation college students. They're older. A lot of them have been through combat. A lot of them have been injured and traumatized and everything else. And so we're producing this generation of people who would go on to write the scripts for our films and television and write our novels in these universities like Antioch and the bigger universities like Berkeley and, those. And they're conditioned by the kind of paradox of American power. On the one hand, the sheer spectacle of it and the scope of it and the potential of it, but also the extraordinary suffering and trauma that are involved in accumulating that kind of power for anyone, And so you see in a lot of that early stuff, there's a real fear of kind of dehumanizing, homogeneity, everybody being the same, everybody being gray flannel, everybody behaving the same way. Conformity is absolutely stifling, you know, partly because of a fear of being different. It was dangerous to be different in the 1950s. So yeah, that's pretty good, you know, and the Godzilla thing is a classic example of kind of exploring that same trope from the point of view domestically of the Japanese. And Brett brings up a great point too. You know, Japan was at that time still unoccupied. They were essentially still occupied. We wrote their constitution. We occupied them with a military government. We told them everything to do. We stripped away an entire layer of power, all what were called the militarists or warlords. They were out of power, never to return, okay? We used our intelligence apparatus and our military to back the installation of a new regime there that governed the way we wanted Japan to be governed. And the Japanese knew it. And they had a civilization far older than ours, and they resented the hell out of it. And they felt like what they were. They felt occupied. So what did they start doing? They started making American gangster movies and American science fiction movies and stuff like that. But they always had a Japanese voice. And they always had a Japanese sense of grievance or irony or humor or whatever it was, because it was their way of venting. On the one hand, in some cases, their admiration for the Allies, but also this horror of, you know, first of all, how close they came to absolute annihilation, but also having lived as a captive people. The Japanese at that time had a tremendous amount of pride and a tremendous history. And they had been the ones used to imposing that captivity on others. And suddenly they were a subjugated people. So Brad, if it seemed like I was doing it, I wasn't trying to undermine your point. It's just that comes out in a lot of the early Kurosawa films. You know, for example, that notion of Japan as being aimless and kind of having no soul, having no core, you know, being subjugated and occupied.
Yeah, no, I didn't think. There was a very specific intent for that movie that I did not know about.
Yeah, well, because it's never one thing. It's never one thing. I mean,
we're still in Japan.
Well, yeah, you know,
Marines there. And
Okinawa. We got, you know, I mean, we're of course we are, because we're still a global hegemon. You know, I mean, the United States, when we get our shit together, can still kind of lean pretty heavily on people. Because we have soft power, we have a lot we can offer economically and diplomatically and otherwise, culturally, if you want to call it that. But also, we have the most powerful military apparatus in the history of the planet. And everyone knows that. Everyone. And they've seen us use it. And they've seen what it does. You know, and that's a source of dread. It's why so many of the young Brits, for example, are horrified of the United States. You know. And they don't hate the Americans, although they laugh at us a lot, but they often hate the American government because their orientation is they grew up in the shadow cast by that dying empire of the 1940s and 50s, you know, and so their grandparents, you know, and parents were the ones who grew out of the ruins of war and this kind of humiliation by the Americans in many cases, you know. This stuff gets very complex, but the point here being, with respect to media and politics, whether intended or not, and this is, I think, what Quinn was getting at early on, film can have a tremendous amount of influence, especially on young people. A lot of you made note of that when we talked about propaganda and what a peculiar inducement that can be for young people, right? It's the same thing with religion. When you're a little kid, the first couple of times you go into a church, it can be powerful, unless you fall asleep, as I did. But it can be overwhelming. You know, because you know what you see for the first time in your lives? You see adults humbled by a power bigger than them. That's astonishing, okay? But if what you saw in terms of that humility was your parents being humbled by an occupying army or by, you know, death from above or something like that, that's going to shape the way you view the source of that for the rest of your life. And it's going to be played out in the music that your generation produces, in the films it makes, in the novels it writes, in everything. Okay. So, you know, that's what we started with, you know, with Quinn's point was that there's no question, tremendous influence can be had here. Even if you're not trying to exert it, if you just want to, some of you said, if you just want to squeeze out money, if you just want to put butts in seats, you're still going to influence people. Does that make sense? In other words, I think that's the perspective of the article. Now we can argue about it, but it is, I thought, compelling to think about entertainment as something more than just, something to kill 68 minutes of your life. Okay? Any questions about that? This was a good discussion. All right. Then what about, do we want to go into the beats? Who wants to do that?
I think it's me and Krista, right?
Yes. Is Krista here?
Yeah, she's there.
Where are you, Krista? Oh, there you, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Hi.
It's so weird because sometimes your screens will move and it's like acid flashback.
Yeah, I've got my camera on and everything though. I'm here.
Okay, so who wants to go first?
I can start it out and give kind of like a little bit of an intro, and then Krista, you can jump in whenever you feel like it. Feel free to cut me off at any point.
There it went. You
Yeah.
guys jumped again. Stop doing that, man. You're freaking me out. I'm telling you. See, it's the evil of science.
Evidently. So this article is talking about the sort of stereotype of the beatnik subculture that was created through media, specifically Mad Magazine. So first you kind of have to ask yourself, who are the beatniks? Who are these freaks? So
These were not freaks. These are charming individuals.
yeah, we'll go with that. So the beatnik subculture was kind of a anti-consumerism, non-conformist bohemian culture that really, I don't want to say sprang out of the beat literary movement, because the beat writers didn't particularly like the beatniks, but they definitely pulled a lot of their sort of foundational ideas from beat writing.
Yeah.
And there was this sort of like pseudo intellectualism that came with what they did. And folks, even if you've like never read beat writing or like expressly like Googled the term beatnik, you're probably familiar with what the stereotype looks like. It's kind of like people in berets and dark clothing, like smoking, thinking that they're better than you, like doing
No,
drugs,
not thinking, knowing.
knowing that they're better than you. Yeah. Like it's in a lot of like kids movies. I think it's in there's a beatnik character in the Goofy movie. Like it's everywhere still today. And so this image of the beatniks that we have was really solidified through media rather than just through the subculture itself. It was kind of like there was a little bit of a subculture. The media picked up on it, started like making fun of it and satirizing it, and then the beatnik culture kind of absorbed it and kept moving on. And so this article really focuses on Mad Magazine and the contribution that they made to.
Can we stop right there real quick? I hate to interrupt, but we have to take this in slices because it's important.
Yeah.
How many of you are aware of Mad Magazine? Okay, probably not most of you, but only a few. That's a separator, by the way, especially if you, like me, if you grew up reading Mad Magazine. I found out, we were looking at that, I was talking to my brother, and I said, hey man, do you remember how old I was when I got my first Mad Magazine? He said, yeah, you were 6, And I said, wow, was I just looking at the picture? He says, no man, you were reading and laughing at it. And I remember those depictions of the beats and things like that, but also I now understand better, almost all of it was written by people, many of whom had tried to make their living on Madison Avenue. They were great artists. They wrote copy and everything. And that was where there was a lot of money. Part of this detonating economic growth of that period of time was marketing and advertising. But these guys, they were themselves influenced by the beats. I mean, they were reading Kerouac, they were reading Burroughs, they were reading these people. They were influenced by that. Some of them were World War II veterans, and they had that going on. So, it was a fascinating time and a fascinating part of the subculture. They weren't just fake. They were outsiders. A couple of them were accused of being communists. Bill Gaines, the editor of Mad Magazine, had to appeal and protect his publications all the way to the national courts. There are court precedents derived from Mad Magazine and from EC Comics that came before them. So anyway, that's Mad Magazine.
Cool. Yeah. So I mean, Bill kind of gave it a better introduction than I was going to, but
I thought, because then you can talk about the beats specific to that though, because they are a component of that.
yeah, absolutely. So Mad Magazine similarly sort of painted itself as this like not avant-garde, but like anti-establishment magazine. It was originally a comic book, and then the comic censors were kind of coming down on them hard because they were, you know, writing things that were not fit for consumption, and there was less regulation in the magazine industry, so they became a magazine. And they were able to essentially sort of advance their own sales of both the magazine itself and then tie-in merchandise through this cultivation of an anti-establishment image built kind of off the back of making fun of beatniks for being hypocrites.
Well, they were calling out everybody. This was a
Yeah,
magazine
not only
satire.
beatniks.
Yeah,
but
I mean, everyone was a hypocrite. That was part of Mad Magazine. Everyone was a hypocrite. And they were calling out the Cold War. They were calling out Vietnam. They were calling out all of this stuff. They were making fun of the most popular movies of the day, all of those. I mean, they were looking for the hypocrisy in all of that stuff, because what they were is they were responding more or less like adults to what they saw in many cases as a trivialized pop culture. And the beatniks were part of that. So what's the connection between the beatniks and the Beats? How were they different?
I don't know, Krista, if you want to take it, I can take it, but I don't want to talk the entire time.
Good. I think the big thing was that the beatniks were sort of inspired by the Beats literature and like music and things like that.
Yeah, they were.
But they weren't really associated with them in any way other than they sort of followed their ideas. The Beats were not like, didn't really take like ownership of the beatniks in any way. That's kind of what I've got. If you want to add anything to that.
That's
Philip?
important, though. It's important because the Beats really resented that. One of the reasons why I included those excerpts of William Burroughs, that ain't beatnik. He's as serious as a heart attack in his writing, and he is completely uncompromising. He's not playing at being different. He's as honest as you can be on the page, you know. And that's something that the beatniks weren't. They were an affectation of what they understood the Beats to be going for. It's like, you know, remember when in the 90s when being a wigger was a thing, right? Like a white, kind of a white, you know, urbanite listening to hip hop and everything, but being kind of a fraud. They used to be called wiggers. And the idea, you know, yes, and I'm avoiding dropping an M-bomb, so I don't want to hear anybody say I was doing that. But the idea was they were frauds. You had these guys living in the suburbs and acting like they lived in a ghetto. That was the beatniks of the 90s and early 2000s. They were affecting to be like hip hoppers. You know, they thought they were freestyling. They, you know, like, you know, whose pants could hang lowest and all that. But these were affluent, middle-class white kids. And overwhelmingly, so were the beatniks. You know, they didn't come from poverty. You know, they had no intellectual credentials. They were frauds. Okay, so what do we learn from this article? What does it tell us about that period of time? This would have been roughly from, let's say, the mid 50s through the mid 60s, somewhere in there. What do we learn?
I think one of my personal biggest takeaways, at least, was that like the whole thing about Mad Magazine is that they were like satirizing and getting onto the beatniks for the limits to their nonconformism, I think is the words that the article uses. When in reality, like Mad Magazine was using those exact things to push their own sort of consumerist agenda.
Well, what was Mad Magazine's consumerist agenda?
They would, I think Dylan mentioned this a little bit, but they were really big about being ad-free, and that they didn't have advertisements in their magazines at all, but almost every article had advertisements for their own merchandise. So they weren't advertising anyone else, but they were advertising themselves.
Okay, first of all, no, that's not true. It's actually not accurate to say that almost every article in Mad Magazine, first of all, it wasn't articles. If you see it, it looks like a comic book at times, but it's just slick covered in slick paper. They sold merchandise because they didn't want to be beholden to Madison Avenue. That was a declaration of principles. They were deadly serious about that. By the way, one of the things that doesn't come out clearly there, this will give you an idea of how serious they were. When Mad became a magazine rather than, as Dylan pointed out, a comic book, that wasn't just because they wanted to, because producing magazines is expensive. It's a major investment, you know. The reason why they did it was because other competing comic books like, Superman and Batman and all that stuff, right, were getting swamped in the wake of these EC comics that were horror comics. And they were pretty gratuitously violent, but always in a satirical way. Okay. And so what these other people did was they pulled together, they actually created something that's almost illegal. They created a kind of a cartel, right? And which, normally something like, anti-trade legislation would prohibit, where they established what they called a comics code. Okay. This had nothing to do with the government at all, zero. Okay. But they were using concerns by the government, by, all these people who were saying, oh, these horror comics and everything are polluting the minds of young people. They're worse than pornography and all that kind of stuff, because they're making people stupid and they're making them illiterate and all this kind of stuff. Well, the comic people were trying to save their industry. One way to do that was to target one of their own and sacrifice them. And so EC Comics was what they sacrificed, not because EC Comics was necessarily the most egregious offender, but because they were the most successful. So they were winning the game when they had to go into court and defend their existence against charges of censorship and all kinds of things, that they were doing all these terrible things. So I don't want you to be left with the impression that the creators of Mad Magazine were themselves hypocrites. Okay. I mean, they made fun of themselves, which is the ultimate lack of hypocrisy, to be able to make fun of yourself. Okay. You'll see in the magazine, they'll do like little quick drawings of themselves. They were fantastic artists, and they'll make themselves look like fools and things like that. Now, they were a business, and so they had to survive. But their whole idea is, we need to find a way to do this that doesn't allow us to be captives of Madison Avenue. That was the enemy. Okay, that was the great homogenizer. So they were trying to, in a sense, to kind of throw a wrench into the works of the culture industry by being satirical. That doesn't always come out in the article. And that's why
I absolutely agree. I appreciate your description, because that makes so much more sense than the article did.
Yeah, well, the article's problematic.
Yeah, it's got the whole section titled Mad's Contradictions and Consumerism. And so I was like, it doesn't totally make sense that you would target them as being a consumeristic product if all they're doing is keeping themselves afloat. So it seemed weird to me that the article painted them that way.
Well, one of the things to keep in mind was their satire was so good. They would do satires of like musicals and movies and stuff like that. And they would do these songs and they would say, sung to the tune of, and it would be some pop song of the day, but it would be often an absolutely slicing satire of something, right? They were sued any number of times by the songwriters, and the courts found again and again and again, no, this is original intellectual property. This is satire, and satire is protected expression. Okay, so they were actually, that's hardly consumerism, to be in court all the time. Remember, that's expensive, going to court. They spend a lot of money on lawyers, So the article doesn't quite, it is a perspective, and that's why I put it in there, because I've mentioned before to many of you that I like to assign readings with which I don't necessarily agree, because I think it stimulates interesting discussion. But I mean, yes, are they a magazine for profit? Yes, they are. They're not like PBS or something. Even that, I mean, they're constantly bothering people for money because, no one else will pay for it. But what doesn't come across in that article, that came across in another article I had, but it was just bone dry, was what the Beats really were and what they embodied. Now think about the lead-in that we started with at the beginning of this class period, when I was talking about particularly the 50s, but also the early 60s, the stifling conformity, the rise of military industrialism, the homogenizing effect of very powerful marketing, the really almost sinister influence of television. Newton Minow called it a vast wasteland and all this. There's every reason to just follow that kind of propagandistic view of the world that we saw in some of those children's magazines, and just kind of be good boys and girls and duck and cover and don't question why, and don't question authority. Do not question authority. Remember that at that time, your K through 12 teachers could still beat you. okay, and things like that. That was accepted because it taught you to defer to authority. So we were very authoritarian. For all that we talk about being the land of the free and all that, the United States in the 1950s was extraordinarily authoritarian. So when people like the Beats, when William Burroughs wrote Junkie in 1947, okay, he was writing a kind of confessional novel completely detached from emotion about being a heroin addict, okay? And it was absolutely uncompromising. And it was the most readable thing he ever wrote. In other words, that was him being nice on the page, okay? But when you read something like Naked Lunch, okay, he's exploding the whole concept of the novel. He's subverting the novel as an expression. He's using cut-up method that he borrowed from Dada from the 20s. He's using taped conversations that he's editing. He's using all these innovative techniques of this relatively new technology to shatter all of the conventions and assumptions about read and spoken art. He's just absolutely transforming that, which, by the way, Kerouac did not do, Ginsberg did not do. Their shelf life and their impact, I would argue, was largely, pseudo-intellectual. But Burroughs was uncompromising, and he frightened people with what he wrote. His view of the world was scary. It was openly homosexual. It was openly anti-authoritarian. And at that time, to be an open male, gay man, homosexual man was a crime, okay? And yet he was not only that man, he was yelling about it in his fiction. He wrote a book, I think that I'd have to look this up. I want to say the first draft of that was 1960, called Queer. He writes about being, I think it was in Mexico City, and sort of being gay in Mexico City. But he writes it like hard-boiled detective fiction. The difference being every bit of it's true, pretty much. He's not making it up. See, Kerouac made shit up. He was a fantasist. He was a fabulist. He was writing comic books compared to what people like Burroughs were doing. Okay, so to write that stuff is one thing. You don't even see that stuff written now. I mean, Chuck Palahniuk tried to do it and couldn't. He had no follow through. He wrote himself out by his second novel. Okay, Burroughs wrote like that from his mid to late 30s until he died in his 80s. And it's that thing about being authentic on the page, being what American creative people are supposed to be, real, having that First Amendment right to expression, having that First Amendment right to a press. It's like, any number of people tried to censor his fiction the same way they did with Ginsberg's Howl. Naked Lunch was in court, he was sued, mostly by the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church was the big problem then. But they won those cases. And they won them because they challenged existing stereotypes and conventions. Those conformist institutions were challenged and many of them were broken. There would have been no 1960s without that kind of dissent. It wouldn't have happened. Certainly wouldn't have happened the same way. I was amazed to read, and also among the friends of mine who were activists and who were musicians, like hardcore, like avant-garde jazz musicians and stuff, who were like 15 years older than me, who'd grown up reading Burroughs and Kerouac. And they took that with them the rest of their lives. I'm trying to link this back to what Quinn was saying about the influence of movies. Literature has a different kind of influence. It's not as widespread because not as many people read. And of those who read, not many of them read that kind of marginal, dangerous literature. But those who do, it sticks. It does not go away. It does not go away. So very powerful stuff. So that was the Beats. Are there other things that you had made note of? I mean, the article's a little tame, really, but I figured there was so little known about both Mad Magazine and about the Beats that I better start with something kind of introductory. Was it useful at all, or was it just dry? You got to tell me, because if it wasn't,
I found it interesting because I'm pretentious. I had like a beat phase in high school, so I was familiar with a lot of like what they were talking about, and like we got Mad Magazine when I was a kid, so when I saw that it was an option, I was pretty excited about it. So I thought it was definitely interesting. There were parts that, like we talked about, I didn't totally agree with or didn't like necessarily understand fully, and it was helpful to talk about it here.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I guess I'm just curious why those two excerpts you picked, but I don't know that that's necessarily the question that you're asking.
Well, the problem with Burroughs, I think I mentioned this before, is that we're under a lot of scrutiny right now with respect to how we teach and what kind of content we allow into the classroom. For all that we're supposed to have protected academic freedom and a lot of other things, we really don't, or only if we choose to use it. Now, I've pushed against that harder than a lot of my colleagues, who outside of literature programs wouldn't include Burroughs at all. The problem with that is a lot of what Burroughs writes will be offensive to a lot of people. If you are religious, you will be offended. If you are homophobic, you will be offended. It's, and so I'm not here to offend you. On the one hand, if I offend you, I don't care that much, but I'm not here to offend you, right? I'm here to teach. And sometimes to teach, you have to break down obstacles. And but the other thing is that Burroughs often gets dismissed because of the sexuality of his writing. Well, he was just he was writing pornography. No, he wasn't. What he was writing was dangerous, but not because it was pornographic. It was because it was anti-authoritarian. He was writing totalitarian science fiction in order to show what was wrong with totalitarianism. But part of it was that his modality of dissent often was not being heterosexual, being sort of pansexual. That sexuality could capture people, but sexuality honestly realized could liberate people, okay? Now, I can read that and not be offended by it or otherwise, but I never know. I have to remember that I'm still dealing in some cases with students who are 18, 19, 20 years old, have never encountered anything like that. And I don't really want to hear from your moms and dads. Honestly, that's what it is. And I had to choose something that was readable for a very broad audience. That's a challenge. That's a challenge with Burroughs. It really is. So that's why, yeah. I've got a bunch of stuff from Burroughs that I went through and I thought, oh, I can't do that. No, can't do that one. Then I'd be, oh no, can't do that. That kind of sex we can't have, Well, I don't care, but some of you do. And I don't have any, I guess my concern is, I don't want anyone to be sitting here sort of squirming and feeling marginalized or put upon because of something like literature. But this is a stupid culture and we do stupid things. And we think that literature is tyranny when it's not. It's just literature, but we treat it like something evil and satanic. And it's not, you might as well say that scripture is evil and satanic for a lot of what it contains. It makes no sense. But that remark that I just made there will get me in trouble. In other words, drawing an equivalence between what William Burroughs writes and what we find in the Bible is going to get me in trouble. But I think it's teachable. I think it's important to remember that you're still dealing essentially with apocryphal things that have not been verified empirically, historically, or otherwise. They may have value to them, so does the writing of Burroughs, but they may have very much in them that is or can be destructive, But it's just, people don't mind how much of the Bible I put in there, but if I start putting things other than that in there, they're going to get exercised. They're going to get exercised. I hate to admit that, but I'm not going to be anything but honest with you. I had to kind of go tame, I would love to teach. I taught a fiction class once when I was a freeway flyer and we used Burroughs and I just broke the label. I just got him into it. I was like, look, we got to get this out of our system. And I read it out loud, and I knew what Burroughs' voice sounded like. So I kind of did Burroughs a little bit and they dug it. Some of the men especially squirmed a little bit, but it's like, anytime men squirm, I'm happy. I'm down with that, So, but that's why. Does that make sense? I'm not asking you to forgive it. I'm just saying that,
Yeah, no, I was just curious because I'd read Naked Lunch a million years ago and I don't remember all of it, but I was just curious why those passages in particular, but I get it.
Well, for one thing, those aren't from Naked Lunch. Those are from other writings.
Some of them. Being from
one of them's Naked Lunch, another one's another.
The other one's not, yeah.
Yeah, and the challenge was to get something from Naked Lunch that was generally readable.
Yeah,
so come on, I did something. Anyway, that's what that is. All right, so With respect to the subject though of the module, as I say, you think about Mad Magazine. Mad Magazine can't survive today. You know, Mad Magazine was a product of what it had to push against, and what it had to push against was this consolidated entertainment industry. You know, what Adorno calls the culture industry, and it was very much alive, and it was extremely powerful. And it had that potential that Quinn talked about, where it could be incredibly influential because it understood what people's marching orders were supposed to be, and it just followed that. The difference was that the Burroughses and people like that, and even though I don't respect his work as much, somebody like Ginsberg, they were deliberately attacking that in some way. Burroughs, more than anyone else, was attacking that. And Mad Magazine, more than any other publication like it, was attacking that. You can go back and find that there were any number of attempts to copy Mad Magazine. They were all garbage because they were faking it. They were beatniks instead of beats in that sense. And that's the difference. Beatnik, then putting the nick on it just from Sputnik, it's a diminutive. It almost means, you know, like funny little beat, cute little beat. Well, the beats were not cute, you know, and there was nothing pretty about them. It was a movement that had about, kind of like the punk movement. You know, I don't know if you've ever heard of a guy named Ian Dury. Ian Dury had a band called the Blockheads. And Ian Dury was a fascinating individual anyway, but he was a guy who was an absolutely uncompromising performer, you know, and, you know, he didn't have a very good singing voice. You know, physically he had polio as a kid, so his whole left side was really like pretty much powerless. He had a brace on his leg and everything, and you know, the absolute epitome of not a rock star, just a guy. And yet, I remember seeing Ian Dury live and thinking that is the most mesmerizing performer I've ever seen, because he broke the assumptions of rock stardom. He was everything a rock star was not, and he was real. He was absolutely authentic. So Ian Dury was very much influenced by the Beats, you know. So you'll see people like that who, and so punk had some of that energy to it. It was some of that, you know, screw you, I don't care. There's a way out of this, and I'm going to find it. The way out of it is to blow right through it. You know, if you think about early Clash and stuff like that, that's what they were going for. You know, early Public Image and, you know, things like that too. Were going for it. It wasn't, you know, J.G. Ballard, speculative fiction author, referred to the punks as like bullfighters. And in Spain, young street kids had no way out of poverty. One way they could do it was have enough courage to get in a bull ring with a bull. And that's where Manolete came from and all that. And so Ballard, I think very astutely, talking in a magazine called Research out of San Francisco, was saying they're like bullfighters. You know, they don't know how to play their instruments. They get up in front of people. They play loudly. They shout their lyrics at the top of their lungs, and they're fearless. And they're admired for that. And they are actually working class heroes, you know, because they're showing the working class should not be afraid, and the working class should not be obedient, you know. And just as there was a right-wing nationalist movement to punk, there was a left-wing and anarchist movement to punk as well. And there was always that political tension. So, you know, one of the things I don't do in here, because I think it was a more important movement in Britain than it was in the States, was punk. But you could do the same thing with punk that I'm kind of doing with the Beats, and it would be more music. Does that make sense? Yeah, okay. Anything else? All right, then. So next week we'll do hegemony in the 60s, and we'll do some stuff on Gonzo and Hunter Thompson and all that. And then we'll have the next assignment. Any other questions? Don't forget to do the note taking in the journal. Okay. All right, then if there are no other questions, I will see you next Thursday. Enjoy your weekend.
You too.
Thank you.